The year is 3441 of the Second Age. On the slopes of Mount Doom, surrounded by ash and ruin, Sauron falls. Isildur cuts the ring from his hand, and the Dark Lord's physical form dissolves into nothing. The last alliance of elves and men has won. The war is over. Middle-earth is saved. Or so everyone believes. Here's what the movies don't tell you, what most fans never stop to consider. Sauron wasn't destroyed that day. He wasn't even defeated in any permanent sense. His body was gone, yes. His ring was lost. But Sauron himself, the Maya spirit who had terrorized Middle-earth for thousands of years, simply waited. For 3,000 years. 3,000 years between his fall on the slopes of Orodruin and his return as the Eye in Barad-dûr. 3,000 years of silence, shadow, and slow recovery. And during those millennia, while the kingdoms of men rose and fell, while the elves faded and the dwarves retreated, while the world forgot what true darkness looked like, Sauron was not idle. He was planning, rebuilding, positioning pieces on a board that most of his enemies didn't even know existed. This is the story no one talks about, the 3,000 years of patient malice that made the War of the Ring possible. And when you understand what Sauron was doing in those long centuries of apparent absence, you'll realize that the events of The Lord of the Rings weren't a sudden crisis. They were the final move in a game that had been playing out since before the Shire existed. First, let's understand what actually happened to Sauron when Isildur cut the ring from his finger. Sauron is a Maya, the same order of being as Gandalf, as the Balrogs, as the spirits who served the Valar before the world began. These beings are immortal in a fundamental sense. Their spirits cannot be destroyed by physical violence. When their bodies are killed, they don't die. They're diminished, disembodied, forced to rebuild themselves over time. This had happened to Sauron before. At the end of the First Age, when Morgoth was overthrown, Sauron's physical form was destroyed in the Cataclysm. He hid, recovered, and eventually returned. When Numenor was drowned by the wrath of the Valar, Sauron's body perished in the waves, but his spirit escaped and flew back to Middle-earth. So when Isildur took the ring, Sauron's body was destroyed, but his spirit endured. The question is, in what state? Tolkien is clear about this in his letters. Sauron was reduced to a condition of extreme weakness. He had poured so much of his native power into the ring that without it, he could barely maintain existence. He was, in Tolkien's words, a mere spirit of malice that gnaws itself in the shadows. But here's the crucial detail that most people miss. The ring still existed. As long as the ring endured, Sauron could never be truly destroyed. His power, his essence, his very being was bound up in that golden band. Isildur didn't destroy him. He just separated him from the source of his strength. And Sauron knew with absolute certainty that as long as the ring survived somewhere in the world, he would eventually recover. The only question was time. The first 500 years after his defeat were, by all accounts, a period of near total helplessness for Sauron. He had no body. He had no servants, or at least none who could find him or aid him in his diminished state. The Nazgûl, his most powerful servants, had fallen with him. Without the ring actively directing them, they had no anchor, no master to obey. They faded into the shadows, dormant but not destroyed, waiting for a call that couldn't yet come. Sauron's other servants, the orcs, the men who had served Mordor, the lesser spirits who had followed him, scattered. Some fled into the dark places of the world. Others were hunted down by the victorious armies of the Last Alliance. The infrastructure of his empire collapsed entirely, and Sauron himself? He was somewhere in the east. Tolkien never specifies exactly where, but the implication is that Sauron's spirit drifted to the far regions of Middle-earth, the lands beyond the Sea of Rhûn and the forests of the east where his influence had once been strong. There, in obscurity, he began the impossibly slow process of rebuilding. Think about what this means. For 5 centuries, longer than many human civilizations last, the greatest evil in Middle-earth was essentially powerless. If anyone had found the ring during this period and destroyed it, Sauron would have been ended forever. But no one did. Isildur kept it, then died. The ring sank into the Anduin and was forgotten, and Sauron waited. Around the year 1000 of the Third Age, roughly 1,000 years after his defeat, Sauron had recovered enough to take shape again. Not a powerful shape, not the terrible armored form he had worn in the Second Age, just a shadow, a presence, something that could think, plan, and begin to act in the world again. This is when the Valar began to notice. Far in the west, in the Blessed Realm, the powers who governed Arda perceived that something was wrong in Middle-earth. A darkness was growing again. The shadow that should have been defeated was stirring, and so they made a decision that would shape everything that followed. They sent the Istari. The 5 wizards, Gandalf, Saruman, Radagast, and the 2 blue wizards, were Maiar like Sauron himself, sent to Middle-earth in mortal form to guide the free peoples against the returning shadow. They arrived around the year 1000 of the Third Age, at almost exactly the moment when Sauron was becoming active again. This is not coincidence. The timing is deliberate. The Valar weren't sending the Istari to deal with a future hypothetical threat. They were responding to an immediate reality. Sauron was back, and Middle-earth needed help. But here's what makes Sauron's strategy so terrifying. He knew they were coming. Sauron was many things: cruel, tyrannical, obsessed with control. But he was never stupid. He had served Morgoth for thousands of years. He had deceived the elves of Eregion into forging the Rings of Power. He had corrupted the kings of Numenor and nearly destroyed the greatest civilization of men. He understood manipulation, patience, and the long game better than almost any being in Middle-earth. When the Istari arrived, Sauron recognized the threat they represented. 5 Maiar, sent by the Valar, specifically to oppose him. If they united the free peoples, if they discovered his plans too soon, everything could fall apart. So Sauron did something brilliant. He hid. For the next 400 years, Sauron made no overt moves. He didn't declare himself. He didn't raise armies. He didn't return to Mordor. Instead, he established himself in a fortress called Dol Guldur, the Hill of Sorcery, in southern Mirkwood. And he operated under a false identity. The people of Middle-earth, including the wizards themselves, didn't know Sauron had returned. They knew something dark was growing in Mirkwood. They called it the Necromancer, a vague, mysterious title that suggested dark magic, but not the return of the Dark Lord himself. For 4 centuries, Sauron hid in plain sight. He let his enemies believe he was a lesser evil, a regional problem, something that could be dealt with later. Meanwhile, he was building power, sending out his influence, searching for the ring, and laying the groundwork for everything that would come. This period, from around 1000 to 1400 of the Third Age, was when Sauron began reassembling his network. The Nazgul were still dormant, but Sauron had other servants. Orcs bred in the dark places of the Misty Mountains and Mirkwood. Men from the east and south, descendants of those who had worshipped him in the Second Age, began receiving whispers from their old master. Spies and agents moved through the lands, gathering information, testing defenses, identifying weaknesses. And Sauron searched for the ring. This was his obsession during these centuries. He knew the ring had been taken by Isildur. He knew Isildur had died at the Gladden Fields, but the ring had never been found. It wasn't in the possession of any king or lord. It had simply vanished. Sauron sent servants to search the Anduin, to scour the region where Isildur had fallen. He interrogated anyone who might have knowledge. He reached out through his network of spies and collaborators, offering rewards, making threats, doing everything possible to locate the one object that could restore him to full power. But the ring didn't want to be found. Not yet. It lay at the bottom of the river, waiting for the right moment, the right bearer, the right circumstances. The ring had its own will, a fragment of Sauron's own consciousness, and it was playing a longer game than even its maker fully understood. So Sauron waited, and while he waited, he prepared. Around the year 1300, Sauron made a move that would shape the next 2,000 years of history. He sent the Witch King to the north. The Lord of the Nazgul, greatest of Sauron's servants, had been dormant since the fall of his master. But now Sauron had recovered enough to call him back to service. And he had a mission: destroy the northern kingdom of the Dunedain. Why the north? Because Sauron understood that the descendants of Númenor were his greatest threat. They had defeated him once. They carried the blood of Elendil and Isildur. If they ever reunited, if a strong king ever emerged to rally them, they could challenge him again. So Sauron decided to break them before that could happen. The Witch King established himself in Angmar, a frozen realm in the far north, and began a centuries-long war against the kingdom of Arnor. This wasn't a quick conquest. It was a slow, grinding campaign of attrition designed to bleed the northern Dunedain dry. And it worked. Over the next 700 years, the Witch King systematically dismantled everything the Dunedain had built in the north. Arnor fractured into 3 smaller kingdoms. Those kingdoms fought among themselves while Angmar picked them off one by one. Cardolan fell. Rudar fell. Finally, in 1974, Arthedain, the last remnant, was overrun. The heir of Isildur's line in the north, Arveduai, fled onto the ice and died. His sons escaped to Rivendell, where Elrond sheltered them. But the kingdom was gone. The great cities of the Dunedain lay in ruins. The population that remained dwindled into a scattered people. The rangers, wanderers in their own ancestral lands, guarding a realm that no longer existed. This was Sauron's work. Not direct conquest, but strategic destruction. He used the Witch King as a weapon to eliminate a threat that might have stopped him centuries later. By the time the War of the Ring began, the northern Dunedain were reduced to a few hundred rangers. They could protect the Shire, but they couldn't field an army. They couldn't challenge Mordor. And that was exactly what Sauron intended. But the north was only half of Sauron's strategy. The south, Gondor, was the greater prize and the greater threat. Gondor in the early Third Age was the mightiest kingdom in Middle-earth. It had been founded by Elendil's sons, Isildur and Anarion, and it had grown into an empire that stretched from the Bay of Belfalis to the borders of Mordor itself. Its armies were vast, its cities were magnificent, its navy controlled the seas. If Gondor remained strong, Sauron could never reclaim Mordor. The Black Gate was watched. The fortresses of Ithilien guarded every approach. The men of Gondor remembered Sauron and remained vigilant against his return. So Sauron set out to weaken Gondor, not through direct assault, but through patience and poison. The first blow came in 1432, when Gondor was torn apart by civil war. The Kinstrife, as it was called, was a brutal conflict over the succession to the throne. The causes were internal: disputes over lineage, prejudice against the king's foreign wife. But the consequences were devastating. Gondor's armies were shattered. Its navy was destroyed. Entire cities were sacked by their own people. Did Sauron cause the Kinstrife? There's no direct evidence, but the timing is suspicious, and Sauron had spent centuries building networks of influence among men. At minimum, he benefited enormously from Gondor's self-destruction. At maximum, his agents may have fanned the flames that turned political tension into civil war. After the Kinstrife, Gondor never fully recovered. And Sauron wasn't finished. In 1636, the Great Plague swept through Middle-earth. It originated in the east, in regions where Sauron's influence was strongest, and spread westward with devastating speed. Gondor lost perhaps half its population. The city of Osgiliath, the ancient capital, was abandoned. The guard on Mordor was reduced because there simply weren't enough men left to maintain it. Again, did Sauron create the plague? Tolkien doesn't say explicitly, but it came from his territory. It weakened his enemies precisely when they needed to be weakened, and it allowed things to happen that couldn't have happened otherwise. Because here's what occurred next. With Gondor's watch reduced to almost nothing, dark things began returning to Mordor. Orcs crept back into the Black Land. Fell spirits gathered in the shadows of the Ethel Duath. The Nazgul, still masterless but drawn by ancient instinct, began drifting toward the land where their power was greatest. Sauron didn't return to Mordor yet. He was still hiding in Dol Guldur, still maintaining his disguise as the Necromancer. But he was preparing the land for his eventual return. By the time he finally entered the Black Gate again, Mordor would be ready for him. Meanwhile, the Witch King struck another blow against Gondor. In 2050, King J.R.R. of Gondor, the last king, rode to Minas Morgul to answer a challenge from the Witch King. He never returned. No body was found. No heir remained. The line of the kings failed, and Gondor passed into the rule of the stewards. Think about the strategic brilliance of this. Sauron didn't kill J.R.R. with an army. He used pride. He had the Witch King taunt the king, mock his courage, challenge him to single combat. And J.R.R., who was a great warrior but not a wise ruler, took the bait. With J.R.R.'s death, Gondor lost more than a king. It lost the principle of kingship. The stewards ruled well, some of them anyway, but they ruled as caretakers, not as sovereigns. The kingdom slowly declined into a defensive posture, always protecting what remained rather than building anything new. And the heir of Isildur? He existed. The line continued in the north among the Rangers, but he was unknown in Gondor. The connection between north and south, already strained by centuries of separation, effectively dissolved. The two realms that might have reunited to challenge Sauron became strangers to each other. This was the 3,000-year game. Sauron broke the north. He weakened the south. He killed their last king. He ensured that by the time he was ready to strike, his greatest enemies would be shadows of what they once were. But Sauron made one critical error during these long centuries, and it nearly cost him everything. Around 2460, the ring was found. A creature named Sméagol, a hobbit-like being of the Stor kindred, discovered the ring in the waters of the Gladden Fields. He killed his friend Déagol to possess it, was driven from his community, and eventually retreated into the caves beneath the Misty Mountains. Sauron didn't know this had happened. The ring had been lost for over 2,000 years, and suddenly it was in the possession of a creature so insignificant that even Sauron's vast network of spies never detected it. For nearly 500 years, Gollum sat in the dark with the ring, and Sauron had no idea where his greatest treasure was. This is the vulnerability at the heart of Sauron's power. He had poured so much of himself into the ring that he couldn't perceive it unless someone actively used it. And Gollum, alone in the dark, rarely used it for anything except catching fish and goblins. The ring was effectively invisible to its maker. But then, in 2941, something changed. In 2941, a hobbit named Bilbo Baggins stumbled into Gollum's cave and walked out with the ring in his pocket. This was the moment everything shifted. Not because Bilbo was powerful or important in any conventional sense, but because the ring had finally decided to move. After nearly 500 years in the dark, it was ready to return to its master. But the ring made a mistake. It abandoned Gollum expecting to be picked up by a goblin, someone who would use it, someone who would draw Sauron's attention. Instead, it was found by a hobbit, a creature so obscure, so far from the centers of power, that Sauron had never even considered them as a factor in his plans. And Bilbo, unlike almost anyone else who might have found the ring, didn't use it for power. He used it to win a riddle game, to escape from goblins, to sneak around a dragon. Petty things. Invisible things. The ring was active again, but it was active in a way that produced almost no signal for Sauron to detect. This bought the free peoples of Middle-earth 60 years they shouldn't have had. But Sauron wasn't idle during these decades. In fact, the late 2900s were when he finally made his move. In 2941, the same year Bilbo found the ring, the White Council attacked Dol Guldur. Gandalf, Saruman, Galadriel, and the other great powers of the age finally moved against the necromancer, driving him from his fortress in Mirkwood. They thought they had won. They thought the shadow had been pushed back. They were wrong. Sauron wasn't driven out. He left voluntarily. The attack on Dol Guldur was convenient, actually. It gave him an excuse to do what he had been planning to do anyway. Because by 2941, Mordor was ready. The orcs had multiplied. The Nazgul had gathered. The infrastructure of evil had been rebuilt in the shadows of Mount Doom. Sauron returned to Mordor not as a refugee, but as a conqueror reclaiming his throne. And the White Council, celebrating their apparent victory, had no idea what they had actually accomplished. They thought they had banished a regional threat, In reality, they had simply prompted Sauron to begin the final phase of his 3,000-year plan. The next decade was preparation for war. Sauron rebuilt Barad-dûr, the Dark Tower that had been thrown down at the end of the Second Age. He raised armies of orcs and trolls and men from the east and south. He sent the Nazgûl out to search for the ring, which he now knew was somewhere in the west. The whispers of Shire and Baggins had finally reached him through the torture of Gollum, and he made alliances. This is something the films barely touch on, but it's crucial to understanding the War of the Ring. Sauron didn't fight alone. He had cultivated relationships with the Easterlings, the Haradrim, the Corsairs of Umbar, and dozens of other peoples for centuries. When he called, they answered, not just out of fear, but because generations of his agents had been working among them, shaping their cultures, directing their hatreds, preparing them for this moment. The armies that attacked Gondor weren't just orcs. They were men, vast hosts of men from nations that had been under Sauron's influence for 1,000 years. The war wasn't good versus evil in some simple sense. It was the culmination of 3 millennia of patient geopolitical manipulation. Sauron had built a coalition. He had weakened his enemies. He had prepared his fortress. And now, finally, he was searching for the one thing that would make his victory complete: the ring. But here's where Sauron's 3,000-year strategy contained a fatal flaw. He couldn't conceive of anyone destroying the ring. This wasn't stupidity, it was psychology. Sauron understood power, domination, control. He understood that beings desired these things, that they would fight for them, that they would betray everything to possess them. The idea that someone might take an object of supreme power and unmake it, that was literally unthinkable to him. When he learned that the ring was in the possession of a hobbit heading for Mordor, Sauron assumed it was a trick, a feint, a distraction while the real plan unfolded somewhere else. He expected someone to claim the ring, Gandalf perhaps, or Aragorn, and challenge him directly. That was a threat he understood. That was a war he knew how to fight. The possibility that 2 hobbits might walk into the heart of his realm with the intention of throwing his power into the fire. It never occurred to him, not because he was foolish, but because it was so far outside his understanding of how beings operate that it registered as impossible. And this is Tolkien's deepest point about evil. It cannot understand good. It cannot comprehend sacrifice, humility, the willingness to let go of power. Sauron had spent 3,000 years planning for every contingency except the one that actually happened, because that contingency required a kind of moral imagination he simply didn't possess. So what do we actually learn from Sauron's 3,000 years in the shadows? First, evil is patient. The modern imagination tends to think of villains as impatient, driven by immediate desires, unable to delay gratification. But Sauron waited 3 millennia. He endured 5 centuries of near helplessness. He spent hundreds of years hiding behind a false identity. He played a game measured in generations, not days. This is terrifying because it suggests that evil doesn't burn out. It doesn't get bored. It doesn't give up. It simply waits for the right moment, building strength in the darkness, preparing for an opportunity that might not come for centuries. Second, evil works through systems, not just individuals. Sauron didn't personally fight the Dunedain of the North. He sent the Witch King. He didn't personally corrupt the men of the East. He built networks of influence over generations. He didn't personally weaken Gondor. He created conditions, civil war, plague, isolation, that caused Gondor to weaken itself. This is how Tolkien understood evil in the real world. It's not just about bad people doing bad things. It's about systems of power, structures of influence, long-term corruption that operates through institutions and cultures rather than dramatic villainy. Third, evil always underestimates grace. Sauron planned for power. He planned for betrayal. He planned for war. He didn't plan for mercy. Bilbo sparing Gollum, Frodo sparing Gollum, Sam carrying Frodo when he couldn't walk. He didn't plan for friendship, loyalty, or love. These things were outside his calculations because they were outside his nature. And in the end, that's what destroyed him. Not a great army, not a mighty hero, a hobbit, a friend, and a moment of pity that Sauron could never have predicted because pity was something he couldn't understand. The 3,000 years of Sauron's patience created the conditions for the War of the Ring. He broke the north. He weakened the south. He rebuilt his fortress, raised his armies, corrupted nations, and searched for his ring. But in all those centuries of planning, he never accounted for the Shire. He never accounted for hobbits. He never accounted for the small, the humble, the overlooked. And that's the final lesson of Sauron's long defeat. The things that seem insignificant, the people who seem powerless, the choices that seem too small to matter. These are exactly what evil cannot see. And these are exactly what can destroy it. 3,000 years of strategy undone by a gardener from Hobbiton who refused to let his friend walk alone. That's not a flaw in Sauron's plan. That's the nature of evil itself, blind to the very things that matter most. If you're walking away from this seeing Sauron's defeat in a completely new light, if you now understand that the War of the Ring wasn't a sudden crisis, but the final move in a game played across millennia, then you're exactly where we want you. Subscribe to Echoes of Middle-earth and join us for the deep dives that go beyond the surface. Ring the bell so you never miss one. And tell me in the comments, what do you think was Sauron's greatest mistake? Was it hiding too long? Moving too soon? Or was he doomed from the moment he poured his power into a ring that could be destroyed? Until next time.